September 9th, 1956. Studio 50 in New York City. The Ed Sullivan Show was America's most powerful stage, the place where careers were made and legends were born. On this Sunday night, 60 million Americans gathered around their television sets expecting another evening of wholesome family entertainment. Instead, they witnessed the birth of a cultural revolution that would split the nation down generational lines. What happened that night wasn't just a performance. It was the moment America's youth declared independence from their parents' world, and it all started with a 21-year-old truck driver from Tupelo, Mississippi, who moved his hips in ways that made grown men furious and teenage girls scream. Elvis Aaron Presley had been causing trouble for 2 years by 1956, but it was regional trouble, Southern trouble, the kind that New York television executives could safely ignore. He'd been banned from radio stations, condemned by preachers, and dismissed by music industry, veterans as a flash in the pan with no real talent. But then something started happening that nobody could ignore. His records weren't just selling in Memphis and Nashville anymore. They were climbing charts in Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, places where Southern music wasn't supposed to matter. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, knew that Ed Sullivan's show was the holy grail of American entertainment. Sullivan had the power to make stars overnight, to transform regional curiosities into national phenomena. But Sullivan himself was deeply skeptical of this young performer who seemed to represent everything that was wrong with modern music. After Elvis's explosive appearances on competing shows hosted by Milton Berle and Steve Allen, Sullivan publicly declared that Elvis Presley would never appear on his program. It was too vulgar, too dangerous, too removed from the wholesome values that Sullivan's show represented. But television is a business, and Elvis Presley was becoming impossible to ignore financially. His appearances on other shows were generating massive ratings, pulling viewers away from Sullivan's program for the first time in years. The pressure from CBS executives was mounting. They needed Elvis, even if Sullivan personally found him distasteful. The negotiations were tense, with Sullivan demanding creative control over how Elvis would be presented to America's families. The compromise they reached would become one of the most infamous decisions in television history. Elvis could perform on the Ed Sullivan Show, but the cameras would only show him from the waist up. America could hear his voice, see his face, witness his charisma, but they would be protected from the hip movements that had been driving teenagers wild and parents crazy across the country. It was a solution that satisfied no one, but allowed everyone to save face. Elvis arrived at Studio 50 knowing that this performance could change everything. This wasn't just another gig at a county fair or a regional television station. This was the big leagues, the kind of exposure that could make him a household name or destroy his career before it really began. The pressure was enormous, but Elvis had been preparing for this moment his entire life, even when he didn't know what he was preparing for. The rehearsals were electric with tension. Sullivan's production team had never worked with a performer like Elvis. His energy was impossible to contain, his stage presence too large for the intimate television studio setting they were accustomed to. When Elvis moved, even in rehearsal, the studio audience reacted in ways that veteran television producers had never witnessed. The screaming, the swooning, the pure hysteria was unlike anything that had ever happened on Sullivan's carefully controlled stage. Behind the scenes, network executives were getting cold feet. They were receiving phone calls from religious groups, parent organizations, and concerned citizens who had heard about Elvis's planned appearance. The criticism was intense and personal, attacking not just Elvis's performance style, but his character, his background, his very right to appear on national television. Some CBS affiliates in conservative markets were threatening to refuse to broadcast the show if Elvis performed. But there was another pressure building, one that was harder to dismiss. The studio audience for the taping was packed with teenagers who had somehow managed to get tickets, and their excitement was infectious. These weren't the usual Sullivan Show audience members, polite adults who clapped respectfully for variety acts. These were young people who had been waiting for someone like Elvis their entire lives, someone who spoke their language and represented their generation's rebellion against the conformity of 1950s America. When Elvis finally took the stage that September evening, something magical and dangerous happened in Studio 50. Despite the camera restrictions, despite the network's attempts to sanitize his performance, Elvis's charisma was impossible to contain. His voice alone was enough to transform the atmosphere in the studio. The way he held the microphone, the way he looked into the camera, the subtle movements that the cameras couldn't avoid capturing, all of it combined to create television unlike anything America had ever seen. The songs Elvis performed that night were carefully chosen to showcase different aspects of his talent while avoiding the most controversial material from his repertoire. He opened with "Don't Be Cruel," a song that had been dominating radio stations for weeks but had never been performed on national television with this level of intensity. Elvis's version wasn't just a musical performance, it was a declaration of independence from the safe, predictable entertainment that had dominated American television for a decade. Even with the cameras focused only on his upper body, Elvis's performance was electric. His facial expressions, his hand gestures, the way he moved his shoulders, everything communicated the energy and sensuality that had made him famous. The studio audience was in complete chaos, teenagers screaming so loudly that the sound engineers had difficulty balancing the audio. This wasn't the polite applause that Ed Sullivan was accustomed to. This was pure pandemonium. The reaction across America was immediate and explosive. In living rooms from coast to coast, families were having their first real arguments about generational differences. Parents who had lived through the Depression and World War II couldn't understand what their children saw in this young man who seemed to represent everything chaotic and undisciplined about modern culture. But their teenagers saw something completely different. They saw someone who understood their frustration with the bland conformity of suburban life, someone who gave voice to feelings they couldn't articulate themselves. The phone calls to CBS began before Elvis had finished his second song. Outraged parents, religious leaders, and community organizers were demanding that the network apologize for exposing America's youth to such corrupting influences. But the calls weren't all negative. Teenagers and young adults were calling to express their excitement, to demand more Elvis, to thank the network for finally giving them entertainment that spoke to their generation. Ed Sullivan himself was caught off guard by the intensity of the reaction. He had hosted presidents and prime ministers, opera singers and ballet dancers, but he had never seen anything generate the kind of passionate response that Elvis's performance was creating. The show's ratings were through the roof, higher than they had been in years, but the controversy was unlike anything Sullivan had ever experienced. What made Elvis's performance truly revolutionary wasn't just his musical style or his stage presence. It was the way he represented a fundamental shift in American culture. For the first time, a performer was speaking directly to young people in a language that their parents didn't understand and didn't approve of. Elvis wasn't trying to appeal to adults or gain their approval. He was creating something entirely new, a form of entertainment that belonged to the younger generation and excluded the older one. The cultural impact of Elvis's Ed Sullivan Show appearance extended far beyond music. It marked the beginning of the generation gap that would define American society for the next decade. Parents realized that their children were developing tastes and preferences that seemed completely foreign to everything they valued. Young people realized that they had the power to embrace cultural figures and movements that their parents opposed. The success of Elvis's appearance also changed television forever. Network executives realized that controversy, when handled correctly, could be incredibly profitable. The massive ratings generated by Elvis's performance proved that there was a huge audience hungry for entertainment that pushed boundaries and challenged conventional standards. The safe, predictable programming that had dominated early television was suddenly looking outdated and commercially unviable. For Elvis personally, the Ed Sullivan Show appearance was both a triumph and a burden. It established him as a national phenomenon, but it also typecast him as a rebel and troublemaker in ways that would follow him for the rest of his career. He had achieved the kind of fame that every performer dreams of, but he had also become a symbol in a cultural war that was much larger than music or entertainment. Looking back, what happened on September 9th, 1956, was more than just a controversial television performance. It was the moment when American popular culture split into two distinct worlds, one that belonged to adults and one that belonged to young people. Elvis didn't just perform songs that night. He performed a revolution. He showed America's youth that they didn't have to accept the entertainment choices made for them by their parents' generation. The cameras may have only shown Elvis from the waist up, but what they captured was the birth of modern pop culture, the beginning of youth rebellion, and the end of generational consensus in American entertainment. That 21-year-old truck driver from Mississippi didn't just sing songs on national television. He changed the relationship between performers and audiences, between young people and their parents, between tradition and innovation in American culture. The revolution that started that night in Studio 50 would continue for decades, influencing every aspect of American music, fashion, and social behavior. Elvis Presley walked onto Ed Sullivan's stage as a regional curiosity and left as the king of a new kind of entertainment that would reshape American culture forever. The hips may have been hidden, but the impact was impossible to contain.